Yeah, it's really nice to see everyone. This is the first public talk I've given in several years because of that little virus that we've all been worried about for a little while. So it's really nice to be doing this sort of thing again, and it's nice to have such a packed audience. As Ellinor's already very well introduced, we're talking to you about our new book, which came out last month. But this is the official launch day, so it's nice to have so many people here to celebrate this. So I'm going to be coming backwards and forwards to the laptop, so I do apologise about getting in the way of the slides, of the projector for just a moment. Just to start with the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs themselves. I'm assuming most of you are local and that you're familiar with the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs. Just in case there's anyone here who isn't familiar with them, these are, of course, a world-famous collection of what we would call paleo artworks. So paleo art is the discipline of reconstructing extinct animals in art. The Crystal Palace Dinosaurs are one of the most significant sites for this from the 19th century. There is nothing else like them in the world. They're totally unique. There was one other 19th century sort of 3D life-size reconstruction of prehistoric animals. That was a temporary thing in Russia in the late 19th century, and that's it. So that's why this place is so special and why we wanted to write a book about it. And of course, the site is not only dinosaurs, it is also a series of rather complex simulated geology. So there is a lot to this place. It isn't just the sculptures that we are very familiar with, which is mainly the dinosaurs. It's also as I say, this complex way to introduce Victorian visitors to the very important discipline of geology. Remember that the 19th century is really when geology is in its heyday, if you like, in terms of its public interest, in terms of its economic interest. I mean, we've got things like coal seams being produced here to stress the importance of geology to the economics of the Victorians. So this is why throughout this talk, you're going to hear me referring to the geological court, which is what this place was known as, rather than the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, because this feels a bit more encompassing of the fact that there is a significant geological component to the site as well. And of course, the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs are so familiar to us that many aspects of their creation will be, just things that we've seen everywhere in so many books and documentaries. I'm sure many of you have seen this image of Waterhouse Hawkins' workshop before. Anyone here seen this already? Put your hand up if you're familiar with this image. So many of you are. This is from the Illustrated London News. This was from New Year's Eve, 1853, and it showed the inside of the work shed. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the main people involved in producing the dinosaurs. These were Professor Richard Owen, and we're going to talk a bit more about him later on. And the main man for putting the paleontological sculptures together, the fossil animals together, was this guy here, Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who is he's sort of the first grand master of this discipline that we call paleo art. This is the guy that we look to as maybe really first getting the full potential of what paleo art could be and bringing it to the people in what he did here at Crystal Palace. So these are familiar names to many of us. I'm sure many of us are also familiar with the New Year's Eve banquet that took place inside the clay mould of the standing iguanodon. So what you've got here is a whole bunch of gentlemen from the Crystal Palace Company, academics. The sculptor Richard Owen is sat here, and there's a table going off into the distance. So if you ever wonder how you get something like 25, 29 people inside an iguanodon, they kind of cheated a bit. So if you were in the elite circles, you're probably sat in the iguanodon itself. If you're not quite so elite, you're maybe shoved onto the table on the side. Apparently everyone did squeeze in for sort of toasts and things. So this is quite a famous, eccentric Victorian story associated with the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs that many of us will know. Another thing many of you will know is, of course, that the dinosaurs don't really look like what we think dinosaurs look like today. They are a stepping stone from the earliest depictions of dinosaurs. They're not the very first depictions of dinosaurs, but they are kind of a progression from the earliest depictions to what we know dinosaurs look like today from more complete fossils. And sadly, one of the other things that many of us will know is that these things are rather fragile now. They are approaching 170 years old, and they are, unfortunately quite frequently damaged through all sorts of things. A lot of it is just the fact that they're being, they're left outside, they are weathering. Unfortunately, there's also issues with things like vandalism. And so every now and then these things make the press, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, back in May 2020, the jaw of one of the most famous and iconic sculptures at the site, the Megalosaurus, fell off. And we don't really know exactly why it fell off, but but fell off it did. And it was actually seeing this that made, sorry, I'm going to ahead of myself a little bit, and just to stress that behind the scenes, behind the headlines, there is also a lot of other stuff happening at the site which is sort of, deleterious to it. So we have lots of plant growth, we have sculptures which are kind of just crumbling and falling apart. They are, in rather sorry state, it has to be said. And of course there is lots of repair work and conservation effort that goes into them, but it's a continual battle for all sorts of reasons. And so it's this situation which actually prompted this book to come about. So after seeing that damaged Megalosaurus jaw, I've been doing some work with the Friends of Crystal Palace Dinosaurs charity, really just helping them research some of the background of the paleontological sculptures. And I said to Ellinor, should we just write a book? Should we put all this together and we'll make it a book for the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs? So when you buy a copy of this, we're not getting any money, the charity is getting everything. All the royalties that would normally go to us are all going to the Friends of Crystal Palace Dinosaurs charity. And within this, of course, you're not just buying it to make a donation to the charity, you're getting a full documented history of the geological court, an analysis of the paleontological sculptures. We're sort of trying to modernize, if you like, the scholarship around this site. So we are trying to move the conversation on, change the narrative as the title of this talk suggests. We're looking at the people involved with it, we're looking at the historic significance of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, and we're also talking about their conservation issues, because this is something that in a lot of literature on the site, a lot of papers, a lot of academic papers I should say, a lot of books that have been written on them, nothing really has been addressing the conservation plight of the dinosaurs themselves. And so what we've ended up with is really something that is part synthesis, so i.e. part sort of just putting all the research together that's been done about the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, and a lot of our own observations, a lot of our own analysis, and so put this all together, and what we've come up with is something which does, I think, move the conversation on it. It's changing the story a little bit about what the Crystal Palace dinosaurs are and what the geological court represents. And it's really some of the main conclusions from that I want to talk to you about today. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is sort of recontextualizing the site and why the Crystal Palace dinosaurs exist in the first place. And to really understand this, we have to not just look at the dinosaurs and the geological core, but we need to go back to talk about the Crystal Palace itself. And I'm sure many of you in here know a lot more about the Crystal Palace site than I do, but the main thing to stress is that this was a sort of a synergy between industry, between science and entertainment. So it was sort of a place people were coming to become enlightened. And one way that the Crystal Palace company chose to do this was to show historic courts. So you could go back to ancient Assyria, you could go back to ancient Egypt, or you could take a stroll through the Renaissance. And they had loads of these things. You go back to lots of different points in history. And the key thing is, as you can see from these illustrations, is that the way these were put together was not to show you artifacts, was not to show you remnants of these historic sites, but to show you them as they were in their prime, when they were to reconstruct them, if you like. And so you can see how you can go from maybe reconstructing ancient Egypt to go, hey, let's go back even further in time and reconstruct what we call deep time. So let's talk about geological time, time before humanity existed. And so within that context, the Crystal Palace dinosaurs fit in quite well with what was happening with the rest of the Crystal Palace site. And this is the full extent, the full planned extent of the geological court. You can see it is quite a complex and busy place. There's lots to take in on this map. The icons in black here are the sculptures that were produced. You'll also notice some in sort of a purpley blue that were never produced. So these are sculptures that were planned, but the project ran out of money and they were unable to finish the full extent of the planned site. We also have a lot of geological strata, which you can actually sort of map in a sort of a mock geological map to say the full complexity of all of that restored geology. So there is a lot going on here. This isn't just sort of a place with some extinct dinosaurs. This was an immersive, literal walk through time. And this is something that we really try to stress about this site, is that these things aren't just arranged sort of randomly about, thinking sort of purely aesthetics. The idea is that as you walk from the southwest to the northeast of the site, you are walking from older rocks to younger rocks. And a good way to demonstrate that is just to take a look at this slide here. We're all familiar with this island. The rocks and the creatures here in the closest to us are from the old red sandstone, which is from the Triassic period. The marine reptiles in just along from that represent the lias, so that's from the lower Jurassic. You then have the oolite next to that, which is from the middle Jurassic, and then we have the Wheeldon, which is the Cretaceous. And if you know your geological column, you will recognize that the Cretaceous is younger than the Jurassic, which is younger than the Triassic. So as you walk through the site, you are being shown the development of life. And of course, at the time, it wouldn't have been regarded as the evolution of life, but you would have been seeing the sequence in which animals existed on Earth, as well as the characteristic rock strata that yielded their fossils. So it's quite an informative and an interesting place. As we said, the full extent of the site was never finished, and this applies to both the paleontological sculptures and also the geological illustrations. So that's what we call the geological features of the site. They're called geological illustrations. And we have a number of them that were produced over here. So we've got a geological illustration, which is the coal face. We have several of them on the main island of the site, and some were also planned for the base of what we call the tertiary island, the tertiary being the what we call the Cenozoic today, sort of the age of mammals, if you like. The tertiary island is clearly the bit of the site which was left most unfinished. But there are actually unfinished bits elsewhere. There were plans to have Silurian and Cambrian rocks as well. So again, if you know your geological record, they are very ancient rocks, getting down to about sort of 400, 500 million years old. We don't know much about them, we just know they were planned, but they were never implemented. They would have been over here somewhere if they were to be put in the site, if it followed the same scheme as elsewhere. And just to stress how really, quite neat the geology of Crystal Palace is, this is the most complex geological illustration which survives today. It's the coal face, and you can see this was actually put together much in the same way that the dinosaur sculptures were put together. It's sort of it's very much a simulated rock outcrop in that there's bricks behind the coal face, and in fact you can actually see them where some of the coal has fallen away. You can see those bricks in place. But then on top of that, you've got different types of rocks. So you've got some ironstone, you've got some coal, and then to make these soft rocks, it was both the ironstone and the coal are real examples of those rocks. People actually went hundreds of miles away to get those and bring them here, and they brought in over 100 tons worth of rocks to build the geological illustrations at the site. But not all rocks transport well, and to make this a real, make this look like a real coal face, they needed to have some soft rocks, some sort of shaly rocks between the coal and the ironstone, because you couldn't really do that, you couldn't achieve that by transporting those actual rocks here. They just fall to pieces the moment you start to dig them up. They're just sort of simulating them by putting some rendering over these flint pebbles. So it's quite a complex and sophisticated way of trying to demonstrate these geological illustrations. This place here is another thing that is quite remarkable. You can still see this today. This is a replica of the original mountain limestone. Today we would call this Carboniferous limestone. And what really makes this one special isn't just the fact that there's like 45 tons of limestone imported from Matlock there, but there was actually a cave that visitors could walk through. So there is a cave entrance here, just kind of obscured by the angle of the photograph, and then you can see the exit to the cave just here. Within this cave was a simulated lead mine and all sorts of simulated natural cave features. So you can see all these stalactites hanging from the ceiling. You can see this float stone that's been put in into the cave, into the mine wall. So the whole point of this was to demonstrate the importance of mining to Victorian culture, because of course you've got a coal face here, you've got things like your lead mine. The people who the Crystal Palace Company board were all very interested in geology. They were all they're all made wealthy by geology, and I think this is their way of saying, actually, geology is really important to us as a culture in the 19th century. And of course, there are other geological illustrations around the site as well. If you look closely behind the Megalosaurus, you can see on top of some oolitic boulders, you can see these fossil trees. These have been imported from Dorset. You'll also have boulders under various other parts of the paleontological sculptures. In other cases, we have more sort of simulation of trying to build cliffs. You can't just bring a cliff in from outside, but you can, if you want, build a sort of a brick wall, if you like, out of bits of chalk. Again, this is another replica of a geological illustration that was destroyed. Most of the geological illustrations you see today are replicas in one way or another. What this really means, and thinking about this idea of changing the narrative, is that when we talk about who built the geological court, we tend to focus on these guys. We talk about Owen and we talk about Hawkins, but we really need to expand this to say there's another couple of guys we need to talk about as well, and they are David Thomas Anstead and James Campbell. Now, we don't have a photograph of James Campbell, so I've used Bruce Campbell from the 1992 film Army of Darkness, which is probably pretty close, right? I'm sure James Campbell actually had a chainsaw for a hand. We don't know he didn't. Anstead, we think, was the guy who was designing the geological court. So that very sophisticated layout that we've just described probably came from Anstead. He was a well-known scientist. He was involved in lots of education. He was writing books for students on geology. So he was the ideal man to try and teach the public about geology. James Campbell is someone we don't know very much about at all. In fact, we've been at a conference for the last couple of days. We might have possibly pinned something down about him, but he's basically an unknown historic figure. We don't know exactly what he did. He may have been sort of the guy who was actually having to do all the heavy work of organizing the importation of rocks from different parts of the country and figuring out how do we get all these things into something which looks like a rock face. Whatever was actually going on here, we need to credit these guys as being architects of the geological court as well as Owen and Hawkins. And speaking of personnel, we need to talk about this guy. We need to talk about Richard Owen. And at this point, I just want to hand over to Ellinor, because Ellinor is obviously based at the Natural History Museum in London, which owes quite a heavy debt to Richard Owen because he basically founded the place. And Ellinor's going to tell us a little bit about how controversial this guy is even today.
Yeah, I thought it was best if I stepped in and said a few words, because Richard Owen was really a very complex character and managed to dominate the scientific landscape within the discipline of basically geology, biology, and paleontology in the 19th century for many decades. And he did many, many good things for not only the basic science, but also outreach and teaching the general public about science in general. One of the things he did is he founded the Natural History Museum, but that was almost 30 years after his involvement here in Crystal Palace Park, and then that, of course, was just a little bit after the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park. So he's a man who had positive impacts, but he also was really quite a challenging character. And you will probably, if you read about the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, you'll often see the first thing that's said is the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, comma, designed by, or something like that, designed by Richard Owen. And Mark and I felt that was perhaps needing a bit of re-examination, and Mark drilled down into the literature, into the archives, and yes.
So as Ellinor has just sort of set up, you could almost rename the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs Richard Owen's Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, according to some people, and put his name right above and that's how he was presented to the 19th century public, because Owen was a celebrity scientist. People knew about him. He was hobnobbing with the higher echelons of society. There were newspaper articles about his science and his achievements. So being able to say that Richard Owen is our paleontological consultant was a big win for the Crystal Palace Company. Just his name would have attracted some credibility and some interest. And so, yeah, there are lots of things he is attributed that are attributed to him. One reason he was particularly relevant as a consultant for the site is this project here, where Owen reconstructed the moa bird. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the moa. It's sort of an ostrich-like bird from New Zealand. Some of them are really enormous, sort of the biggest birds that have ever existed, with maybe one or two exceptions. And the story goes, and I stress this is a story because there are historic facts that maybe contradict it, The story goes that Owen was given this fragment of a femur, which is your thigh bone, and Owen said, oh, that belongs to a giant flightless bird. And over time, and he also said it would look something like an ostrich. As more bones of the moa were found, lo and behold, Owen was right. And if you're trying to reconstruct dinosaurs from scrappy fossils, having the guy who reconstructed the moa on your team, again, seems like a win. So Owen was quite an important figure in terms of giving the site some credibility. However, in terms of his actual consultancy role, Gowan Dawson, in his 2016 book, Show Me the Bone, concludes that from looking into lots of archives and lots of details about the relationship between Owen and the Crystal Palace Company, concludes that Owen was basically absent from the entire project, and to the extent that there are grovelling letters sent from the Crystal Palace Company and from Waterhouse Hawkins to Owen saying, can you please come and do your job? He is just completely absent from the site. He maybe visits once or twice in the entire 2 or 3 year history of the site being put together. And what we've continued to analyse Owen's role in this by looking at the fossils that were referenced in the paleontological sculptures. So we've actually, it's not so difficult to do this because there weren't so many fossils known in the 1850s. And you can just say, okay, so what do we actually know of Iguanodon? What did we know of Labyrinthodon? And you can put these things together and compare the sculptures that have been executed with Owen's own opinions that he's been publishing in his own papers. And what you find is that there are a number of contradictions where Hawkins has been reconstructing things that Owen would have disagreed with. And one of the most famous examples is this thing here, which is probably one of the most famous things at Crystal Palace, which is the nose horn of the Iguanodon. Of course, we all know today that that is a thumb spike. And this is generally attributed to Owen and said, oh, people at the time thought that that was a nose horn. Owen completely disagreed with this. He figured out that this strange bone was a claw. Now, he actually thought it was a claw from the foot, but given how unusual this is, if you've ever seen an Iguanodon thumb spike, they are strange looking things. But he was able to figure out, well, that joint is clearly something that goes on the end of a finger, or at least a digit. And given its size, it was not unreasonable to assume that it would have belonged to a foot. Also remember that Owen thinks that dinosaurs are quadrupedal, and therefore everything's going to be a foot. So Owen was actually pretty smart. He figured out what the nose horn, what this so-called nose horn was, and if he had been an attendant consultant, this would not have happened. An Iguanodon would not have had its iconic nose horn. And there's lots of other examples of this at the site, and I'm not going to go through them now because it's a very hot day and we'll just push on. The take home here is that this idea that Richard Owen is sort of the chief intellect behind this, feeding his ideas into Hawkins, is almost certainly incorrect. What Hawkins is really doing is he's providing his own interpretation of the works of a number of different people, including famous scientists like Gideon Mantell and George Cuvier, and he's making his own reconstructions based on them, maybe with some input from Owen, but probably not very much. And that moves us on to appreciating the Crystal Palace dinosaurs as masterworks of paleo art. So I've already said that Hawkins can be seen as the first sort of grand master of paleo art. And the reason I think this is the case is that a lot of reconstructions of fossil animals in the 19th century, they tended to kind of fall into two camps. Some of them were extremely basic, things like this. This is nothing more than an outline of an animal, and it really doesn't show us very much in terms of detail. It's extremely conservative. The other side of things are fantastical illustrations, which cast dinosaurs as dragons, and you've got marine reptiles here acting as almost like sea serpents and ripping each other apart. And all this stuff is absolutely terrific, but it doesn't look anything much like real animals. They look far more like, and indeed there are even kind of conventions taken from illustrations of mythical beasts, dragons, and so on. And so within this, Hawkins' reconstructions kind of fit somewhere in the middle, because he wasn't being overly conservative. He wasn't saying that, well, we don't know what he was putting in details of skin texture, like on the flipper of this ichthyosaur. He was painting them, so he was giving them colors. He was giving them real, sort of the real life appearance of true animals, but he also wasn't going so far as to make them look fantastical. And it's that middle ground, which is where paleo art is probably best achieved, where you're not being so conservative that things are sort of dull and boring, but at the same time, you're not you're not going so far the other way that it looks like you're just drawing a bunch of monsters. There are, however, some indications, because a lot of the appreciation for Crystal Palace is about how naturalistic everything looks. And if you walk around the site, the iguanodon looks like it's just noticed you as you come around the corner, and maybe it was chewing a leaf a moment ago, and it's going to go back to doing that in just a moment. But we do know that Hawkins did want a bit more dynamism in the site. Originally, the pterosaurs were going to be planned as sort of taking off. They were going to be diving into the water. The plesiosaurs were going to be depicted as fighting each other. So this kind of serene, fairly sort of naturalistic, out for a walk in nature kind of appearance that we now have at Crystal Palace wasn't always the plan, and we don't know exactly why it deviated from this. But it's just interesting that there are some, the concept itself has changed a bit over time. And there are other ways that we can appreciate really the nuance that Hawkins brings to these artworks. And one of the best examples of this are some of the least popular animals at the site, which are the Anoplotherium. So these are the sort of the somewhat camel-like, sort of camel, deer, dog things that exist on the edge of the tertiary island. What I really like about these is that they show real slice of life kind of behaviors. So Anoplotherium at the time was thought to be semi-aquatic. It was thought to be sort of swimming in water using a powerful tail to move itself, propel itself forward. And there is an individual in a strange pose right on the bank of the tertiary island. And if you've got a dog and you flick it with enough water, you can get it to replicate that pose. This was the most difficult thing to do in the book, trying to take a photograph of a dog shaking itself. So that dog is just down there now. So hats off to Bew for putting up with me torturing her for a day to try and get a photograph of her shaking. But this is really progressive. This is the kind of stuff that modern paleo artists would do and think they're like on the cutting edge. And yet here it is in the 1850s. The other thing of note about the Anoplotherium is that if you look at the cranial proportions, i.e. you look at the shape of the head, you'll notice that there are different shapes. And it's probable that this is sexual dimorphism, i.e. Hawkins is trying to show male and female Anoplotherium commune, which is really quite, again, no one else has ever done anything like this up until this point, and it's the kind of thing that we would put in a modern paleo artwork, but in the 1850s, this was like super cutting edge stuff. And Hawkins was also thinking about how these animals work. He wasn't just sort of taking complete skeletons, because of course in many cases he didn't have complete skeletons to work from. He was taking the bits and pieces of information that he had and trying to think, how does this work as a sort of an integrated functioning organism? So a good example of this is the estimates of the size of the head of Megalosaurus was about 5 feet, so sort of just over 1.5 meters. And Hawkins is thinking, how on earth do you hold up such a massive head on an animal like this? And we don't know much about dinosaur anatomy at this point, but Hawkins realizes this is a problem that he has to solve. And what he speculates is this big hump over the shoulders. And this is a really sensible thing to do, because if you know mammal anatomy, you'll realize that this is what you see in a whole heap of mammals that have got big, heavy heads. So if you're a rhinoceros, or if you're many breeds of cow, you have got enormous shoulder muscles that run from your shoulders, connecting to the back of your skull, and there is often a big hump over the back of the head. And I think what's interesting about this is that Hawkins is basically correct. He's kind of right for the wrong reasons, if you like, in the sense that he's come up with this idea of solving the heavy head problem that we see actual heavy-headed dinosaurs doing. They do it in a slightly different way, of course, because they're not built like Hawkins thought they were, but they do have a suite of adaptations related to supporting enormous heavy heads. So Hawkins was anticipating these problems and he was solving them. He wasn't just drawing dragons. He was really trying to think very, very hard and comprehensively about these things. And similarly, if you're lucky enough to ever get close to these sculptures and you look at the detail that's been put into them, you realize that there's entire muscle plans mapped into them. Remember that Hawkins didn't have complete skeletons of these things. So he's imagining what the skeleton looks like, and then he's imagining what the muscles would look like on top. And again, he hasn't just put these on randomly. He knows the basic muscle plan of limbed vertebrates. So the sort of muscles that we have across our body are pretty universal across anything with 4 legs and a head and a tail. And you can look at that and go, oh look, there is the line of the latissimus dorsi. This here is the bulge of the deltoid. And it's, that's amazing amounts of detail to be put into these sculptures. And it's evident even in things like the Megatherium, even though you've got all of that fur covering it. And it's worth stressing how little fossil material Hawkins was often working with. The mammals were very well represented by fossil skeletons, but really most of the fossil reptiles and everything on a secondary island weren't represented by very much at all, with a couple of exceptions, the marine reptiles and the teleosaurs. But things like the Megalosaurus, you're really just not working from much more than this. What we can say is, at very least, this was one complete species that he was reconstructing. Hawkins was also, however, making chimeric assemblages. So he was working with bones from what we would now recognize as being several different, sometimes closely related, sometimes unrelated animals. And so, again, we were trying to drill into this for our book and to try and figure out, what do these animals actually represent? And one of the most interesting things to come from this is that these iconic iguanodon, which are probably some of the most famous bits of Victorian paleo art in the world, I would imagine, none of the fossils referenced in these were actual iguanodon bones. They are all now referred to other iguanodonts. So yeah, iguanodon doesn't actually contain any iguanodon. Maybe even more surprisingly, some of the material, some of the fossil material being referenced in these sculptures are from completely different types of animal. And I really think one of the most interesting things, they're quite easy to ignore because they're relatively small and not quite as spectacular as the dinosaurs. But these labyrinthodon are really fascinating for the chimeric mix of different bits and pieces they represent. So these are depicted as giant frog-like animals, and appropriately, there are some bits of large and fossil amphibian inside them. However, they also have the footprints of a crocodile-like animal, and they have these bones referenced in them, which belong to these bizarre sail-backed things, which are really nothing closely related to anything alive today. They're on the crocodile branch of reptile evolution, but they're pretty distinct. We call them Tenosauriscids. And really, this thing down here, Labyrinthodon pachinathus, this kind of the very small, knobbly-skinned Labyrinthodon, it's really more representative of this than it is of this. This is the kind of giant amphibian that these other bones belong to. So again, you've got chimeras of things which are quite closely related in iguanodon. You've just got an assemblage of different iguanodonts, whereas this is just a hodgepodge of all sorts of different animals. And that's really quite fascinating to see that being executed. In terms of how the models themselves were actually built, the general picture of how the models were constructed is something that we've known about for a little while now. This is something that we've moved this along a fraction, but really it's just sort of putting together what people have already learned. We've benefited a lot from conservation work, which has literally taken these sculptures apart and put them back together again. And of course, when you do that, you can start to see what's going on inside them. And so we have a pretty good idea how a lot of them were built. What we have really lacked detailed insight into is some of the specific sort of methods into how they were executed. And so again, we're all familiar with this image of, some of us are familiar, sorry, I should say, with this image of Hawkins' work shed. And if you, there's some really great articles by journalists describing walking through this, and it sounds wonderful. If you're into models of dinosaurs, they're just in every nook and cranny, like leering out at you. It sounds like an amazing place to be. And we were curious to try and see what was really going on in that work shed. We know basically how the models are being reconstructed, but there's still some questions to answer, like how do you move them around? What were they actually working from? And so by looking at some lesser known images of Hawkins' work shed, we've been able to answer some pressing questions about this. For one thing, we're aware that there were smaller models that were made first, which is exactly what you'd expect someone to do before making a giant life reconstruction of something. So they were probably working to sketches and models right alongside the giant models themselves. So these things were already being planned and mapped out before they were executed at full size. This image here is also very interesting of the Megatherium. This is an unusual sculpture in that it is completely carved out of limestone. So there's a chap here, you can see I think, it's a little bit difficult to tell in the quality of the image that I have, but I think this is actually him chiseling out the fur of the Megatherium. No other sculpture here has been made like that. And that there's no one specific way the sculptures are made. It is all a little bit different depending on what the animal is and what it has to do, where it has to be placed. We were very excited to see these images for a couple of reasons. One of the most notable ones is the presence of these wheeled carts, because there's been some discussion about how do you move these things around the site. Do you build them in place, or do you build them in the workshed and then move them around? And lo and behold, there we go. We've got some suggestion that these were actually mobile, and you could build them in the shed and then move them around. We also have a number of photographs. These are from, I think, 1855. So this is the final stages of development of the geological court. And these tell us all sorts of really interesting stuff. This is, you can just get lost in these photos looking at different details. So things like this, we have these tents over the Megalosaurus and the Haleosaurus, where presumably they're being constructed. There's also, if you look in the right-hand side of this image here, there's one of the ichthyosaurs in pieces. So this is suggestive of another construction mechanism. We don't really know exactly what's going on with that, but there's clearly something to look into there. I mean, you get the impression that they're just sort of doing things however works best. There's no one fixed plan for this. It's just, okay, we've got 2.5 years to build a bunch of giant dinosaurs. How are we going to do it? And it's just make it up as you go along and get the job done. There are a number of interesting things in these photographs as well. So this is from the other end of the site, probably from the same set of photographs as the previous previous two. There's things like plaster casts. So these are probably being, we know that there's plaster put around the sculptures to cast from clay originals, but was this plaster being used also to protect the sculptures during transportation? Down here is an interesting thing, because that is a sculpture just put there on its side. So this is one of the Paleotherium, and it's just there, sort of just chilling out. I guess it's waiting to be put, several hundred meters away on the, several tens of meters away, I should say, on the tertiary island. So clearly these things are mobile, they're being moved around, and focusing on that model brings us to probably what is one of the most significant parts of the book, which is uncovering the forgotten history of the site, and particularly thinking about missing models. So today, if you tally up the number of species and models in the geological court, you'll find they represent 21 different species, and there are 30 models of extinct animals. However, having completed our assessment of the site, we think there are actually 24 species originally represented and 37 models. So that's a 20% difference, more or less, between what we have today and what was originally there in 1854. And that's much higher than anyone else has previously assumed. We knew there are some missing models. We're all familiar with the fact there's a couple of pterosaurs missing, but we didn't realize that there might be 7 models missing. And this does change our perception of what the site may have been like when it was first opened. Just to run through the missing models, I think the most familiar to us, some of you may have even seen these. The most famous missing models are the Jurassic pterosaurs. So these would have sat next to the Megalosaurus. We don't have many sort of photographs of the originals, but this is one from the early 20th century. These were lost at some point, we're not entirely sure when, early 20th century probably. They were replaced with replicas in the early noughties. These have since also been lost. We do have them, we've got one of them at least, haven't we? But yeah, exactly why they fell down and what happened to them, we're not really sure. But so there have been attempts to replace them, if not entirely successful. Lesser known missing models, we're all familiar, of course, with the giant deer, the Irish elk, or the Megalosaurus, or whatever you want to call it. Originally there were 4. Today there's 3, but originally there's 4. And we are lucky just to have the edge of the missing model in this photograph here. If we blow that up, you can see that there are 2 females. So this animal, we think, was moved to where the coal measures now are in 1870, and we don't think it ever came back, because in conservation work in the 2000s, a hoof of this animal was found in the mine. So what has happened to that, we don't really know, but there's clearly more history to dig into there. We also have this guy here. This is Paleotherium magnum. This is the sculpture that was on its side. This is maybe one of the more significant missing models, because we don't have anything else like this at the site today. So there are other Paleotherium, of course, but if you're familiar with those sculptures, they really look nothing like this. This is about the size of a small horse. It's kind of got elephant-like features rather than tapir-like features. It's actually quite well documented. It's probably the best documented of all the missing models, because it appears in numerous illustrations. This is a photograph of it from 1855. So we have a pretty good idea of what Paleotherium magnum may have looked like, but it's only recently that we've realized that it was actually missing. You just need the right people to look at these photographs and go, hang on, that's not the Paleotherium we have at the site today. One of the most significant conclusions, I say, from the book concerns this sculpture here, which most of us probably know as the Megaloceros fawn, the baby deer that sits next to the giant deer. This is really, I can hand the story over here to Ellinor, because this is really your story of how we came to maybe realize that a baby deer is not what this sculpture represents.
Yeah, so as someone who's gone around the park almost every day for many, many years, I would walk past this sculpture and I thought there was something a little bit amiss about it, but you know, a lot of the sculptures are slightly wonky, and I didn't really pause to look at it very long. And then recently, when we were going through working on the book with Mark, and he paid a visit to look at the sculptures, he and a couple other colleagues were over looking at the Irish elk sculptures, and I was stuck outside the fence. That's one of the benefits of a wheelchair life. And I sat there staring at the sculpture for a good 20 minutes and kept thinking, it just doesn't look like a baby anything, let alone a baby deer. I mean, baby deers have big heads, sort of short little noses, and not these long gangly arms and big rounded bodies like that. So when these guys came back from their measuring process, they jumped back over the fence, and I said, look at this animal, look at its face. It doesn't look like a baby deer at all. It's got these slit kind of nostrils, and the eyes are sort of set in the wrong place, and the ears at the wrong place too, you know. And so we talked about it for a while, and then another of our dinosaur friends uncovered the tail that's on the right side, and you'll see it's a very long tail, again, not like a baby deer at all, and everything just seemed wrong about it. So we discussed it at length, and I said, I really think this looks like one of the more camel-like animals. And Mark then had to go home. He did his research while he was on the train, looking at some of our resources for the book. And he pulled out the pictures that you have just seen, the engravings from 1854, and found...
Okay, yeah, so what I found, I slightly misjudged which slide was next. What we concluded is we knew there's some confusion about whether there was an animal in the park called Anoplotherium gracile, which is today known as Xiphodon, and that's what we've been referring to it as, to just not confuse it with the other Anoplotherium species that's here. What Ellinor was observing were features that are consistent with what was known as Xiphodon in the 1850s. So you've got an animal with a long neck, these very long, slender legs, this sort of camel-like face, and a longish tail. I don't think the tail was completely known, but it got you thinking that, there's confusion about whether Xiphodon is here in the park. It certainly fits Xiphodon anatomy. And then we looked at this illustration here. This is what I'm like glancing at my phone, trying to figure this out on the way home. I had seen this illustration, and I just couldn't figure out what was going on here, because these illustrations are pretty accurate. You can recognize this labyrinthodon. You can recognize the giant stag here. And it's like, so what the heck is this? And I just didn't know what was going on with that. But then Ellinor's observations, like, oh wait, that fawn, that's clearly the Megaloceros fawn here. And then you realize, well, there's actually 3 other sculptures of the same thing. And there is no mention of a Megaloceros fawn anywhere in the historic archives of the site. There's nothing to say they built a baby deer, but there is plenty of stuff saying that they built a small herd of Xiphodon. And so what we're starting to think is, oh wait, that baby deer is the Xiphodon that was built at the site, and probably these 3 were built as well, based on the authenticity of these images. And so these are our 3 other missing models. Exactly what happened to them, we don't know. This is something that we discovered quite late in the book writing process, so we haven't had time to really delve into it that much. We are pretty confident, based on a map that Hawkins drew in 1855, that the Xiphodon was placed here next to the other Anoplotherium, as would be appropriate for its position in geological time. Remember that this is slightly older than that, and this animal was from what we call the Eocene, so it's older than the Ice Age animals which are over here. Obviously, our Ziphodon at some point has been moved to its modern location, and we don't know when that happened, we don't know why that happened, but that is our new hypothesis. This is not a baby deer, it is Anoplotherium gracile, or as we call it today, Ziphodon gracilis. So that's a pretty big revelation for the park. We have a species here that we didn't actually know we had. That does clear up some confusion about what is actually here, but it's kind of also, it's one of these things which is exciting because we've found out a new thing. It's also worrying because you think, how can all those sculptures disappear without a single record? And that is really the whole, a major take home from this, is that the records of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs are not in great shape. Moving on, I'm going to try and get through this quickly because I think we're probably pushed for time. One thing we also look at is the legacy of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs. So we talk a lot about the fact that these were really iconic and influential sculptures. So you see them replicated a lot in subsequent artworks. This isn't Hawkins drawing this stuff. This is people going, hey, those Crystal Palace dinosaurs are pretty neat. I'm going to draw them in my artwork. And so you see them appearing in picture after picture for the next 40 years. They are very prevalent in artwork. So they're very, very influential in that sense. The public, however, were not, it's not that they weren't enamored with them, they certainly were, but the public didn't really know what to make of them. Bear in mind at this point that things like dinosaurs, pterosaurs, these are still pretty new concepts to the public. They're very familiar to the geologists of the time, but if you were into geology, you had a bit of money, even if you were just pursuing it as a hobby, you were able to afford to buy expensive books about this stuff. The man on the street, the lady on the street, they hadn't yet really got to grips with deep time and with extinct animals. And so a lot of the public response was, we don't really know what these things are. What didn't help is that the entire Crystal Palace site, whether it's geological court, whether it's the Egyptian courts, etc., not a single sign or interpretive panel to tell you what's going on. So all of this amazing complexity that's here, you have to figure it out on your own. You have to just absorb it somehow, like some sort of knowledge osmosis. Or, if you want to cheat, you buy the guidebooks. So it's sort of this half philosophical, half sort of business-minded approach to trying to enlighten people, but it meant that people didn't really know what they were looking at. Critics of the Crystal Palace were actually pretty fierce. So the dinosaurs themselves, they enjoyed a very brief burst of enthusiasm from scientists, but after that they just started laying into them and they weren't happy at all. And in part this is because of something that we've already covered. Lots of paleontologists at the time thought this is as far as paleo art should ever go, and that even this is like, okay, well, you're kind of pushing it a bit. But this is what some people wanted. We have to remember that when the Crystal Palace dinosaurs were built and unveiled to the public, fossils were still being found and the science was still moving on. And very quickly, the Crystal Palace dinosaurs in particular, I'm talking about the real dinosaurs here, the Iguanodon, the Megalosaurus, and the Haleosaurus, within a couple of decades, we knew that dinosaurs weren't quadrupedal rhino-like animals. We knew they were things walking around on two legs, looking very different to what was reconstructed at Crystal Palace. And certain influential, particularly American paleontologists, just really had lots of nasty things to say about the Crystal Palace site. And what's interesting about this is that the Crystal Palace dinosaurs may have actually led to a little bit of a cessation in development of paleo art. Although paleo art is still being produced in the late 19th century, what you find is that people are just still replicating things from the earlier parts of the 19th century. So they're just kind of reusing Hawkins dinosaurs. They're using some dinosaurs produced by other artists. They're not really doing anything new. And we suggest that this is because the critical savaging of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs may have just tied into ideas that science should be conservative and that you don't want to push things too far. And so that probably gave the Crystal Palace dinosaurs a greater longevity in paleo art than they probably deserved. These images here are from the 1880s and 1890s, and really at this point, these things should have been, I guess, extinct in paleo art for several decades, and yet here they are, they're still lingering on. And it's really not until the turn of the 20th century that we start to see lots of new reconstructions of fossil animals being developed. And of course, it's around at the same time that critical responses from scientists also starts to soften. I think maybe you get away from that initial impact and that initial kind of surprise of someone being so audacious as to try and reconstruct whole dinosaurs from little more than a few bones. But you get to the 1890s, and people start to say, hey, look, we have to look at these things in appropriate historic context. They did the best they could at the time, and actually there's a lot right about these. We tend to focus on what's wrong, but there is a lot right about these reconstructions, and you can certainly see that they represent a step forward from the very first reconstructions of dinosaurs. They are a clear middle ground between those original ones and later reconstructions. And where am I going with this? And of course, this is where the Crystal Palace dinosaurs are at sort of the turn of the 20th century. Things are just starting to turn around for them. They are certainly, in terms of their place in history, they are kind of going into being finally praised for the first time, certainly by scientists. It must be said that the public did start to lose interest in them around this time. But of course, then in 1936, everything changes for the Crystal Palace site, because the palace itself burns down, and that's really a change of fortunes for the dinosaurs as well. You should of course remember that the geological court is really the only major surviving element of what in terms of like an original representation of what it was like to visit the Crystal Palace. But of course, once the Crystal Palace itself disappears, the nature of the park itself changes, and as I'm sure many of you know more than I do, this is a very different era for what happens to the geological core and the park itself. And so that really brings us to the final thing that we want to push home, which is that we need to talk about the fact that we're not necessarily doing, or haven't necessarily done, the best job of looking after these models. As I said at the very start of this, these things are unique, and when they go, that's it. There's nothing to replace them. You can't just go, oh, well, these ones are gone, but at least there's that Crystal Palace Dinosaur Park in France. That's it. They're gone. So we need to talk about this, and we need to be sort of frank and honest about what is happening here. And of course, sometimes this makes the news. We have things like the broken Megalosaurus jaw. Sometimes if there's sort of, you see people being foolish and put in their snaps of riding a iguanodon on Twitter and that sort of thing, you get sort of the outrage pieces in the local news. But behind the scenes, there's these kind of these big things happening, but there's also this slow creep of degradation in the site. And you've got things like major cracks forming in the giant dinosaurs. You've got plant growth over the geological illustrations, and of course think of all these roots going in here. They're cracking the coal, and they're splitting the flints apart. Recently, this photo is from last year, as you can tell, because obviously this antler on this Megalosaurus is now missing. Poor little Paleotherium minus has been missing his head for several years now. So there is this kind of continual battle, and there has been a continual battle against degradation at the site really since we think about 1870. That's the earliest record we have of things maybe needing a bit of patching up. And there have been attempts to do this, but we don't know much about them, surprisingly. You'd have thought there would be good records of what work was being done at the time, how much money was being spent, what work was specifically being done to different models. It's actually really difficult to come across any records on this. Obviously, you may have figured out from the timeline of when we're writing this book, we did a lot of this in lockdown, and so it might be that now we can get out into the world a bit more, that we can find some more details on this. Maybe they're actually in physical archives rather than online ones. But yeah, so we have got some conservation happening, but we don't know as much about it as we would like. And it's not just big things like replacing sculptures and missing models that we're concerned about. It's also this sort of the fact that because we don't know the history of conservation, it's actually quite difficult to determine what parts of the models are original and which part are now sort of second or tertial interpretations of those models that have been broken. And there's good examples of this, things that went completely unnoticed until recently. Jeremy Young, who specializes in the geological illustrations here at the site and is the treasurer of the Friends of Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, noticed in a video, this is from 1959, that our Plesiosaurus macrocephalus has lost its head. And if you go back into archive images, you see that Megacephalus once had a much bigger head. Things like the original antlers of the Megalosaurus are gone. These antlers look entirely different. These were original fossil antlers, which look nothing like these ones. We don't know when these were installed, or what, and similarly with things like the hands of Megatherium. So Megatherium is a giant ground sloth. It's meant to have these enormous, great big like mitts for hands, and he's got these enormous claws on them. You can see here that Megatherium in this guy is looking a bit like Donald Trump. He's completely orange and he's got tiny hands. At some point, this whole limb has been replaced, and it must be said that this is not particularly sensitive to the original construction of the Megatherium hands. Similarly, down here, this is the small Paleotherium model, and you can see that in 1958 it had a very different head to what it has had in recent years. And this is, again, because this is all undocumented, it's just this slow erosion of originality, and it's really only by comparing what was with what we have today that you realize how much the site has changed. We're not looking at an original geological court anymore, we're looking at something that has been altered over time. And we are lucky, however, that Historic England has recently stepped in. And Eleanor, I don't know if you want to say anything about this by a letter by someone that you might all have heard of. Do you want to?
I think it speaks for itself. So Sir David Attenborough is a fan of the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs and has been for many, many decades. And when Historic England took the decision in 2020 to put the site on the Heritage at Risk Register, which is a good thing. It sounds terrible, but it's good because it increases the urgency and likelihood of actually halting the decline of the site. Sir David wrote back and said he was very glad to hear this news and congratulated us on that step. So. Yeah,
so this is being recognised really quite widely, the fact that we've now got Historic England considering these at risk, and that really is kind of where we are at the minute. There's still discussions going on about how do you preserve this for another 170 years. That's the question. At the minute, if it's left as it is, it certainly won't last another 170 years. So it's great news that there is now, for the first time, we think, plans being put into place for a long-term management and repair to be continual at the site, which is what it needs. This is clearly not something that you can just sort of fix everything. That's what we've been trying to do. We've just been trying to fix everything up and then go, right, job done, and then you just sort of let it degrade again. We need to get out of that cycle of repair and degrade. And so hopefully that's what will happen in future. And that's really it. I think that's everything we have to say. Except, of course, that obviously, if you want to, if you're interested in the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, you've got the Friends of Crystal Palace Dinosaurs charity who are doing all sorts of events, and there's things online, things like the site itself that you can come and do. You can also donate to the charity directly with cpdinosaurs.org/donate. And of course, you can also buy a copy of our book. We've got it for sale here today. Now, the recommended retail price of this is £30, but today it's being sold for £25. And this is, looking around online, I think that's about the cheapest you can get it. So if you'd like to get a copy, this is a great opportunity to get one for a knockdown price. And while you're here, we can put a little squiggle in there as well if you want us to devalue your book by signing it. And that's it. So thanks very much for listening and for sweating along with me. We're going to do the book signing outside, so fresh air is imminent. And thanks very much.
So if anybody's flagging, feel free to slip out, but we also have time for a few questions. We have some hot questions burning here.
I think
maybe there's a hand that's come up here. I'd like to call on Bob Nichols, also a famous paleo artist.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there are still some mysteries to be solved. Is there any information? You've got a room full of local people here that might have friends and relatives that might have experienced things that would shed light on any mysteries you might have. Is there anything you would particularly like to ask?
That is such a good question that I wish I had planted it. Okay, so if anyone didn't hear Bob's question, what Bob alluded to was that a lot of the recent issues with missing models, conservation, etc., a lot of that has happened within recent decades. So it's potentially things that people may know about, particularly if you've got if you've lived in the area for a long time, or you've got relatives that lived in the area for a long time. We want to know what has been happening in Crystal Palace. So if you talk to your friends, your family about what you remember about the site, maybe you've got photographs of the models in different states of repair, different configurations, different paint schemes. All of this kind of thing is what we want to know. So if you've got information, please don't keep it to yourself. As I've said, the records of this stuff are not good, and any information that people have, any old photograph can completely alter our perception of what a model may have been like at some point in history. So great question, Bob.
And just to add on to that, we have a archival photograph project. If you've got family photographs, the older the better, but any picture of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs from the past, and you're willing to just digitize them, send them our way. We look at all kinds of things like the vegetation, the water levels, the amount of erosion on the islands, the condition of the sculptures, whether they've got the wrong head on them at one point in time or not. We made an extraordinary discovery through our Monument Monitor project, where we found that half of the head of the standing iguanodon actually was missing in 2010, and there seems to be no record of it. It was repaired, and nobody of the 16 people that I wrote to, who should have been the people granting permission for this work on the Grade 1 sculpture, actually knows anything about what happened, when, and who fixed it. So that came out of just putting a shout out and asking people for photos from the past. So if you've got them, put them on send them through to our website.
Question there? Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question, but all this business about looking into the past. I mean, when I first came here, it was at a canoe competition in the pool, and I sneaked out to see the dinosaurs and took shitloads of slide photographs of them. And that was probably in the mid to late 70s sometime. So I might have to spend months finding them, but I will look for them.
That'd be really great. I think
I remember a period when they put back the right vegetation amongst the dinosaurs. There were all these artificial cycads that had suddenly been, and I can't remember when that was, but I would have also taken pictures then. That was much more recent. I mean, probably a couple of decades moved on. My question was about the big banquet that they had in the base of the thing. I think that might be one thing that's not in your book, which I've read avidly, but maybe it is and I've missed it. I think that might have been the Bartlett Society, and I think that took place here. But I'm thinking of your construction idea. Clearly that would have had to have been in situ to sit all these big Victorian guys in there having a banquet.
So I'll move things back so people know that what we're talking about.
Okay.
So this is, we do actually talk about this in the book.
Forgive me though.
No, it's
I've only got it recently and I'm really rapid reading, trying to soak it all up.
Okay, I'm glad you've raced through it and hopefully enjoyed it.
That's it, yeah.
Yep. So this is actually a really fun thing to talk about. So I'm really glad you brought this up. So this is a very famous event. This is New Year's Eve. It's 1853. It's a week to go before New Year's Eve, and then Hawkins sends out invites saying, "Hey everyone, come and have a banquet in the Iguanodon." So this thing is organised with a week's notice. As I said, I think there's a lot of kind of just making this up as you go along. This is a great press opportunity. This is what this is. This is a PR stunt, because this is going to get in the newspapers because it's such a crazy thing to do. So what actually is going on here? This is not the model of the Iguanodon that we have on the site today. This is the clay mold. So to build these giant dinosaur models, they were first made in clay, and then they were cast in plaster. So they had a sort of a plaster mold they could then press into the concrete that went around the brick and iron versions that we still have. So these clay things would have been destroyed. They were just temporary. They were the sort of the first versions of the models we built, but only to provide them with that plaster mold. And so what you can see in here, if you look closely, is that the head, only half of the head of the Iguanodon is covered. The rest of it has got very little, only the top half of the head has got any detail on it. All of the texture underneath is pretty smooth. And this is because that is the plaster that is around the clay model. What has probably happened is that they finish casting this thing and they think, what are we going to do with that clay Iguanodon? Well, we're going to destroy it anyway. Let's have a party in it first. And Yeah, so this is probably within Hawkins' workshed. Another reason we're pretty happy it's in the workshed and not in the site itself are all of these stairs and platforms. If you look at the other images of the workshed, there are all of these stairs and platforms around as well. And again, with a week's notice, you're not just going to be knocking this up. You know, this was an opportunistic PR stunt, so you're not just going to be going, oh, let's build some stairs for that. What was probably a bit more you know, swiftly arranged was this canopy. We know this was pink and white, and you've got these names of prominent scientists up there. So there would have been a bit of rushing around to dress up the workshed and also keep the draft out. The workshed was meant to be very damp, very rainy, but by all accounts it was, there's a wonderful journalistic account of a visit to the workshed and describes actually walking up to the place itself as just this absolute quagmire of mud and horribleness to get to. But then you get inside and it's this sort of treasure trove. But that doesn't mean the workshed itself was necessarily nice to be in. Remember, this is the middle of a Victorian winter, so it's, you know, cold and it's wet and it's rainy. But yeah, so there's a really cool story behind that, so I'm glad we went back to it. Another question from Bob?
Just a very quick comment. I think in the bottom right there, that's a piece of the mould. You can see
Yeah,
the skin.
absolutely. Yep.
Where was the shed?
I don't know exactly. No. I mean, it's in the park grounds somewhere. It's not like off-site.
So nearby?
Yeah, nearby. But I don't know of any specific. I don't know of any articles or maps that give a specific location. I think it must have been pretty much where the geological court is today, only because in the same account that describes how sort of muddy and it's described as like being a ploughed field, I think, having that sort of you know, quality to it. The journalist in question spoke about how they sort of came to where the palace was being built and then they had to trudge some distance to get to where the sculptures are being manufactured. So it probably is roughly where the site is today, which would make sense if you're looking to build all your stuff. You don't want to have to transport them all long distance. I mean, some of these things will be really big and heavy, so you build them as close as you can to it. Yep. Is that a question from Ellinor?
Yeah, am I allowed to, yeah. I actually have some news. It's news for absolutely everybody in this room, including key players, because something came through on my phone during the talk. So, Bob Nichols and Mark Witton had a suggestion over a year ago that we actually restore the most critical missing, recently missing sculpture, which is the Paleotherium Magnum. If you put that up.
Yep.
And we've been discussing, we put together a little grant proposal, got provisional funding and agreement in principle from appropriate bodies to rebuild. Where is it? Wait, our timing is a bit off here. Uh-oh. Is it coming?
Oh.
There it is. To rebuild this darling little thing, this dour and very charming sculpture of Paleotherium Magnum. And we've been working on this for some time. And we decided that we would, after we got the funding, we decided we wouldn't mention anything about it until we knew that Bromley Council was going to clear us, almost certainly, for planning permission. And while I was sitting here, I got an email from the planning department and they said, planning permission is not going to be needed. So, we're introducing to you today Bob Nichols' project of reconstructing Paleotherium Magnum, with input from Mark Witton, and it's going to happen over the next year. Next April 1st, we hope, we're going to declare Magnum Day, where we have not only we'll have the reveal of this wonderful sculpture that's been missing for 50 years, but was in place for over 100. And it's also the date of, Manu Gemma, you can just say the magic words.
Fingers crossed for the handover of the park from Bromley to Crystal Palace Park Trust.
And so the trust will be managed, the trust will manage the park from here in the park, and basically all the communication will become much more joined up. And this is with the support of Bromley, but we've got a new team of highly skilled people on the trust who will be working with in the future. So this is pretty exciting stuff, and you're the very first to know. Bob didn't even know this until we walked in, so yay!
Yep.
Could I just ask regarding the colour of the dinosaurs when they were very first built? Was it at a time when photography, there might have been photos, or was everything just sketched by newspaper artists? And if so, have they been able to colorise any of the old black and white to get an approximation of what the original colour might have been?
So there are photographs, so just in case anyone didn't hear, we've been asked, is any of the photographic evidence of the sculptures indicative of their original colour? Yeah, so we do have photographs of them. Everything is in black and white, unfortunately, and I don't think any attempt has been made to colorise those photographs. What has been done to try and deduce the original colour is, before conservation work commenced in the early 2000s, which stripped the sculptures of all of their paint, paint samples were taken to try and figure out what those original paint layers, what those colours were. And we've been talking a lot about that at a conference for the last couple of days as to how reliable some of that analysis is, but the take home seems to be that they are probably not too dissimilar to how they are currently painted. So the dinosaurs would have been sort of greenish, the labyrinthodons were sort of greenish with yellow underneath, the mammals were brown. The ones that are the real sticklers, the ones we really struggle with, are anything that's got water around them, because that has just made the paint degrade very quickly. And so things like the marine reptiles, the teleosaurs, the mosasaur, it's very difficult to say anything about those because, yeah, the data is just gone. But there might be more news on paint analyses and things coming in future, because I think it's something people are excited to look at. So, yeah.
Just ask one other question. The degradation that you spoke about, is that something a little bit like film, in that the older they get, whatever you do, the breakdown will just either accelerate or is something that can't really stop?
Ellinor, is this a question you want to answer, because you know more about this than I do?
Yeah, I mean, the question is about, the question was about whether the decline is accelerating and whether it reach a tipping point, really, I guess is what you put. And certainly there is a tipping point where any object can't be recovered and it needs to be recreated, or that the expense is too great. And for example, the jaw of the megalosaur at the moment has a temporary prosthesis which has been 3D printed. The original pieces are being held for potential conservation in the future if there's funding that allows. But yes, that is actually a problem of potentially losing it. At the moment, there certainly is hope for most of the sculptures, I would say, but Historic England is doing a very detailed assessment to find out exactly what the conditions are for each of the sculptures and what would be needed to hold it in best shape. So what we see as the site is not the sculptures in their as individual entities only and separated from each other. We see the concept of the site and the intention behind it as the thing that we also find as paramount, what we want to conserve for future generations. That said, historic conservation relies on the genuine artifacts being there, the genuine objects being there. So we will do everything possible to ensure that the actual material that Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins worked on remains in the site intact as much as possible. So that's the long-term objective for the future.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Regarding the workshop,
Yep.
for the more modern version, on one of my infrequent visits, I was told when I saw some animals were missing, or I think it was when the pterosaur, the winged reptiles, were damaged or taken away. Someone told me with great authority there was a store somewhere where there were moulds of all these different animals, and they could easily remake them. And that sounds now like that was a load of nonsense, but...
No, it was true. The store, it's a storage area, but the molds were made out of silicon, and they were folded up And apparently, when you fold up a silicon mold, it can keep forever if, number one, you coat it with talcum powder so it doesn't stick to itself, and number two, you don't heat it up. And it was stuck in a shed with a metal roof. And so we pulled it out, and I've got a picture of it. When we first started Friends of Crystal Palace Dinosaurs, we found the broken bits of the pterosaurs, and we found folded up silicon mold. It's like a big blob of nasty yellow gunk, completely stuck to itself, and there's no way to recreate that. So basically, it was that was lost. That was lost, and we haven't yet recovered the designs for doing that, but that may come up in the next round of works. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Okay.
I just ask another?
Yep.
Obviously, the dinosaurs are very important, but you were talking about the integrity of the whole, and I just wondered, you mentioned about the coal face and bits of that dropping off, etc. How much of a problem is the degradation there? Is it equal to the damage that time does to the dinosaurs, or is it not as bad?
So the question was about the condition of the geological illustrations and whether they're also in dire conditions, and that depends on the illustration. Some of them are in terrible shape, and the cave and mine would be extremely difficult to recover the whole thing. We could probably stabilize it to about a half or a third of its former self. Other parts need just regular maintenance, but the coal face that you saw is, as Mark pointed out in quite some detail, it is suffering quite a lot. There are plants growing through it. Buddleia and its dreadful roots are separating parts of it. And the front facing of it, when you see all those little pebbles that Dick pointed out, you're actually not supposed to see those. And when you see bricks up there, that's the fake wall, that's the wall that is the back of the stage set of that illustration. On the lower left, you can just see that. So yes, a lot of work needs to be done on some of the geological illustrations. Some of them are holding together pretty well.